Welcome to another episode of Synthpop Reviews. In this episode, we're going to continue with the series that I began a while ago of choosing one of my favorite synthpop bands and doing a deep dive into that band, every album, and some of the best songs on each album. At the end of the episode, I will pick my 3 favorite albums by Alphaville, and also I'll list 10 of my favorite songs. Let's get started. So I think most people are aware of Alphaville probably because of one of 2 songs of theirs, probably Forever Young and possibly Big in Japan. Sometimes Alphaville are unfairly labeled a one-hit wonder. People think that Forever Young is their only hit, and that is very far from the truth. Alphaville is a very talented band that has produced amazing work. In fact, they're easily in my top 10 of favorite bands, maybe as high as top 5. At one point, they were my very favorite band. But you know how these things go. As you experience new music, sometimes things shift, and then they shift back again sometimes. But I would put them at least in my top 10, maybe top 5. A little background about Alphaville. They're a German band that right off the bat from their first album produced synth-pop music. Alphaville is known for the beautiful vocals of Marian Gold, their lead singer. He's famous for being able to sing very high notes, but the fact is, he can also sing very, very low notes. That amazing range that he has produces just some of the best vocals I have ever heard in new wave or synth-pop music. Along with Marian Gold, the classic lineup of the band featured Bernard Lloyd and also Frank Mertens, at least for the first album, Forever Young. After Forever Young was released, Frank Mertens left the band and was replaced by Ricky Ecolette. I may be mispronouncing that, but Ricky did replace Frank Mertens in the band. Eventually, Alphaville became just a duo, Marian Gold, Bernard Lloyd working together. And then since that point, there have been other lineup changes, new members of the band, people dropping out and into the band. But that classic lineup is Marian Gold, Bernard Lloyd, and either Frank Mertens or Ricky Ecolette. In addition to the beautiful vocals of Marian Gold, I would say Alphaville stands out for the very crisp synth pop, especially on that first album, and then also for the fantastical writing that is featured in many of their songs. The imagery that comes from listening to their songs is incredible. They're referencing planets, they're referencing mythical creatures, they're referencing Shakespeare. Just all of these different wide-ranging references to literature, to mythology, science fiction, and fantasy. Their lyrics really do take you on quite a journey. For me personally, Alphaville was an important band. It was probably the second or third synth-pop band that I really latched onto. After Thompson Twins, that was my first, and then I think it was Alphaville, or it could have been OMD. And like I said, eventually they became, at one point, my favorite new wave or synth-pop band. Okay, let's go to their discography and take a look at the albums that they produced. They started out their career with a bang. They produced the album Forever Young, and the results are phenomenal. The highlights on this album are definitely Forever Young and Big in Japan, but in my opinion, just as good and just as much of a highlight is the beautiful, outstanding song, Sounds Like a Melody. This was a minor hit in addition to Big in Japan and Forever Young, but I feel like it should have been a much bigger hit than it was. It's a fantastic song, one of my very favorite Alphaville songs. Other highlights on this album include A Victory of Love and Summer in Berlin. Those are both excellent. To Germany with Love is kind of moody, but I really like it. And then I have to also mention Fallen Angel. The vocals on this song are incredible. I love how Marian Gold's voice sounds. It's just one of their best songs, in my opinion, and yet most people haven't heard it. It's not played on the radio, but it's a fantastic song. The Jet Set is also a pretty good song. Other people seem to like it a little more than I do, but it is one of the better songs on the album. So I've mentioned my favorites from this album, almost every song, as you can tell, and I hope you can see why it's just wrong to call Alphaville a one-hit wonder. In fact, Big in Japan was a bigger hit at the time of this album's release than Forever Young, so that's 2 hits right there off of their debut album, with, I think, Sounds Like a Melody also counting as a hit. And then many more songs that really should have been, because they're right up there with those classic songs. I think if you have to own just one album by Alphaville, this is the one. Forever Young. Alphaville followed up Forever Young with an interesting album called Afternoons in Utopia. And with this album, Alphaville got very ambitious. They hired live musicians, basically an orchestra, to play live instruments, in addition to the synths and the guitars and other instruments that the band naturally had at their disposal. And they combined all of those elements into a different sounding album. Afternoons in Utopia sounds quite different, in my opinion, to Forever Young. In my opinion, there's a little more depth to this album. It may take a little while for these songs to stand out for you and to really sink into your soul, but if you give it time, it will do that. I have come to love this album just as much as Forever Young. Even though the songs didn't perform as well as singles as Forever Young and Big in Japan, there still are some good singles on this album. I would say the most obvious standout tracks on this album are Dance With Me and Red Rose. I think those were released as singles, and I really like both of those songs. As a kid, listening to the radio, I did hear Red Rose and Dance With Me on our local new wave radio station. But other songs that I like from this album include Fantastic Dream, Jerusalem, which really conjures up some interesting imagery as I listen to that song, Afternoons in Utopia, that sounds just beautiful as you listen to the amazing vocals. Sensations, I think, should have been a bigger hit than it was. The Voyager is solid. Carol Masters is an interesting song. And then one of my personal favorites is Universal Daddy. It's actually a really cool song. And again, the lyrics take my mind to places that are interesting. So that gets us to Alphaville's third album. Now, I forgot to mention when the first two albums were released. Forever Young was released in 1984, so pretty early in the 80s. Afternoons in Utopia came out 2 years later in 86, and then there was a 3-year break for Alphaville. In 1989, a lot of people were really anticipating the third Alphaville album, and their record label was as well. They thought this would probably be a big hit, and it seems like they put a lot of money and funding into this third album, The Breathtaking Blue. My first experience with this album was hearing the song Romeos on our local radio station. They played it all the time. I would say at least once every hour and a half or 2 hours. I knew if I turned on the radio and listened long enough, I would hear this song, and I loved it. I thought it sounded amazing. The song starts off with this heavy guitar sound that is not normally associated with Alphaville, but it's really cool sounding. And then it turns into this driven synth-pop song, yes, still with guitars, with very cool sounding lyrics and vocals. And I just love this song, Romeos. Especially when I was a teenager, it was my favorite song for quite a while. When the album became available, I was so excited to purchase it, and I did. I bought it on cassette, threw it in my stereo, and the first song that came up was Summer Rain. And Summer Rain couldn't be any more different from Romeo's. It's a very calm, peaceful, very slow song, thoughtful lyrics, and I was kind of taken aback. I didn't really like it at first. But when it was over, Romeo's came on and I was excited. Everything was great. I have to say, the first couple of times listening to the album all the way through, I was a little disappointed. I was hoping for more songs like Romeo's, and I didn't find anything to that level. Eventually, our local radio station started to play The Mysteries of Love a lot, similar to how much they played Romeo's. They also played a song called Ariana. They played that a lot as well, and I kind of like that. But overall, I was a little disappointed in this album. Now, fast forward a few years, this album came to be one of my favorites. Similar to Afternoons in Utopia, I think it grows on you. If you listen to it enough, the songs seep into your soul and you end up really loving them. I like the whole album, but these are the 5 standout tracks in my opinion. Summer Rain, Romeo's, She Fades Away, and The Mysteries of Love, and a 5th song that I haven't mentioned. It's called For a Million. Once again, the lyrics in this song take my mind to places that I would never have imagined. It's like reading a fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel and being transported. So while I would probably say there was only one legitimate hit on this album, Romeo's, even though there was lots of radio play for The Mysteries of Love and Ariana, and in some parts of the US and the world, For a Million was also a pretty good hit. But I would say the whole album has become pretty important for me personally as a really solid album that I go back to. After The Breathtaking Blue, there was a 5-year gap between that album and their next album. I was living in Chile when this next album came out. It's called Prostitute. And when I heard the name of the album, I thought, oh, that doesn't sound like an Alphaville album at all. The title just didn't seem to make sense for an Alphaville album. Eventually, I did pick up the album, and I found it to be a really good comeback album for Alphaville. It's very heavy on the synth sounds, which I love. None of these songs were hits in the United States or even got any airplay, I don't think, in the United States. This album was produced much more for European audiences, South American audiences, not really even targeting the American audience. And that's a shame because several of these songs are very catchy and fun, and if you're an Alphaville fan, you're going to want to listen to this album. My favorites on the album are Fools, Ascension Day, The Impossible Dream, which is a beautiful kind of ballad, Beethoven, which is a really cool song that I like, and then a song called Ivory Tower that is a beautiful one for me as a big Alphaville fan. What this song does is it name drops several of Alphaville's other songs, some of their biggest hits, as well as some of their deeper cuts. And if you're a big fan of Alphaville, if you listen carefully, you will hear your favorite Alphaville songs name dropped in interesting and catchy ways. I really love that song. Next, we get Faith, which is a beautiful, upbeat song. And then there are 2 more tracks I have to highlight. Iron John is, for me, kind of the sleeper song of this album. It has such an atmospheric, moody sound to it, and it tells the story of Iron John, which is kind of a mythological story, in such a way that it's very powerful, and there's a little bit of a creepy vibe that I get, but so cool. And the lyrics are interesting, the vocals are amazing and powerful. The final track I want to mention is Apollo, and I really like that song. It's one of the upbeat songs on the album, very beautiful. 3 years after Prostitute came out, an album with a little bit more upbeat title of Salvation came out, and I believe, this is just my own thoughts, that the title of those 2 albums are connected. Based on some of the imagery that's in the liner notes and the artwork, I think those 2 albums are meant to go hand in hand. Salvation is an album that took the band in a little bit different direction. They seem to embrace even more their synth-pop sound that they started with in the album Forever Young. And this album came out for me in 1997 at a pivotal time. I was looking for more synth pop. And for those of you that weren't paying attention to radio or maybe even alive back then, you've got to know that that was a dark time for synth pop. There was a lot of grunge going on. There was a lot of shunning of synth pop bands, and it was hard to find quality synth pop from bands other than some of the mainstays like Pet Shop Boys and Erasure. But this Alphaville Salvation album came out, and it was just amazing. I loved it right off the bat. The standout song right away, in my mind, was Monkey in the Moon. The lyrics are crazy and confusing, but I can't resist this song. I think it's great. I do worry that a couple of the lines of the lyrics come a little close to blasphemy. I hope not. I would be surprised coming from Alphaville, but if I set that aside and just focus on the song, I think the song sounds great. Other standouts on the album are Inside Out and Guardian Angel. The song Flame sounds like another attempt at Forever Young. It's beautiful, not as great as Forever Young, but still worth listening to. Spirit of the Age is cool. Soul Messiah is great. And then New Horizons is a beautiful song that I really like. Lots of synth in that. And then Pandora's Lullaby is another highlight for me. After Salvation, Alphaville kind of disappeared from my consciousness for a little bit. I still loved their albums and listened to them, but the new music they produced seemed to be too expensive and hard to find. They came out with this really cool box set called Dreamscapes. It's really hard to find. It's rare. They later came out with Crazy Show, which I do own. That's another rare box set of CDs. And there are some good songs on those big box sets, but because they're not generally available, I'm going to skip them in this video, but just know that there are some gems on those sets as well. Okay, so if we kind of bypass those box sets, then we go from 1997 Salvation, and then fast forward 13 years to 2010 when Alphaville released Catching Rays on Giant. Now, this was with a different band lineup, but the same fantastic vocalist of Marion Gold. And this album harkens right back to the glory days of the album Forever Young. I read one critic that said that it sounds like they were frozen in time and thawed just exactly how they sounded in 1984 with Forever Young. Of course, the band lineup was different, though, but the synth pop on this album sounds very crisp and sharp, just like it did on that first album. My favorite song on this album is The Things I Didn't Do. It's got a powerful message. It's well written. There's kind of a surprise ending. I just love that song. Other songs on the album that I think are standouts are Song for No One, I Die for You Today, Heaven on Earth, Miracle Healing, which I think is a fantastic song, Carry Your Flag, Phantoms, and Calm Me Down. Just a really strong album. I enjoy this album start to finish. It was an amazing comeback for Alphaville. Now we get to the most recent Alphaville album of new songs, and that's Strange Attractor. Again, with a different lineup. I was so excited to get this album in 2017 when it came out. I had loved Catching Rays on Giant so much that I thought this is going to be more of the same, and I was instantly disappointed. The sound is very different than the previous album. I still came to enjoy it after listening to it several times, but for me, there's really one standout song here, and that's Marionettes with Halos. Kind of a strange song, but I like it. It's catchy. I do kind of like Heartbreak City as well, and there's other songs on there that are good, but they don't really stand out for me. And that's the most recent album of Alphaville's that's all new songs. In 2022, Alphaville produced an album called Eternally Yours that's very interesting, and I enjoy it, but what they did is they revisited some of their hits and other favorites, and you've got Marion Gold singing along as normal, but instead of synth pop, we've got an orchestra playing the music. This is a popular thing to do for a lot of synth pop bands, and I think it works well. It's fun, it's interesting, but I consider it a different kind of album. It's not really original songs. These are their own songs redone. So I'm hoping for more Alphaville albums in the future, but for now, that takes us through their discography. At this point, I'm going to name my favorite 3 albums, and this is going to be tough. This is one of my favorite bands. It's going to be hard to leave one out. But I'm going to have to say the obvious one first, Forever Young, their first album. You've got to have that. Next, I'll pick Salvation. I think it's a fantastic album, start to finish. And then finally, I'm going to go with Catching Rays on Giant. Just an amazing comeback album for Alphaville. Next comes the hardest part for me, naming 10 of my favorite Alphaville songs. Let's get the obvious ones out of the way first. Forever Young and Big in Japan. I'm going to say Sounds Like a Melody. I'll say Dance With Me, Romeo's, For a Million. I'm going to say Iron John as well. I want to say all of the Salvation album. I'm not going to be able to name all of my favorites here. I'm up to 7 already. I'll just say Guardian Angel, but I could pick any number of songs from Salvation. I've got to choose I Die For You Today. And then I'm going to pick a B-side from Alphaville. At least I'm pretty sure it was a B-side. The song Sister Sun. It's got kind of environmentalist lyrics, but I just love the sound and the music of this song, Sister Sun. So those are my top 10. But I could have listed another 15 or so songs that are basically tied for that top 10. So we come to the end of my deep dive into Alphaville's discography. This music means a lot to me. I love it, and I always hope for more from Alphaville. Thanks for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed this content. If you did, come back next time for the next episode. And please do check out my blog, synthpopreviews.blogspot.com. There you'll find my other episodes as well as reviews from years ago. You'll find a link to my Synthpop CD collection, which is a great way to discover new music. And my blog is also a great way to get in touch with me. If you're a synthpop or new wave style band and want to get your album or your songs reviewed, contacting me through the blog is the best way to do that.